Welcome, everybody. We have one of the most important artists in the entire semester of all the artists covering today, and that is Rembrandt. I can tell you the odds are very high that one of the slides you're going to see today of Rembrandt's work would be very high probability that will be on the midterm. Okay, let me admit one more person here. Okay, but first, before we get to today's lecture, I just wanted to give you guys all a chance for one more, um, you know, class. I always do this at the start of each class to ask any questions you have about the papers, which you know are due on Wednesday. I give you guys till midnight before they would be late. So in other words, as long as I get them before midnight Pacific Standard Time, of course, California time, they'll be on time. But don't wait until 10 or 10:30 to make your final revisions. I've received, I think it's only 3 papers out of 3 classes. What is that? An average of 1 per class of people who said they, wanted me to check their work, and they were already very good papers, but maybe missing a couple things. So at this point, my cutoff for that would be tomorrow about 5 p.m. because in the evening I do need to stay away from computers. So what I'm saying is, if you have a sample of your writing that you have that you want me to look at, you could send it tonight. I won't get back to you till tomorrow or tomorrow daytime, but not after 5. However, now is the time to ask questions, any kinds of questions about anything relating to, of course, the papers, the slides we've already covered, like the early Baroque that we've covered. We're going to do now, the rest of Baroque, most of that today, or extra credit options. I've had people asking questions a lot about creative things. For instance, if you went to Europe last summer or whenever, before this semester, well, technically, I shouldn't have those included as an architecture option because I intend to have you see the site, architectural site, whatever it is you choose to photograph, or museums while you're in this class, so you can see, hopefully, with the knowledge that, again, hopefully you're gaining from the analysis that we've been doing, the formal analysis, and how to understand meaning. So my answer in general would be, it needs whatever you want to do for extra credit needs to be done, that option, during this semester. So hopefully that answers a few people's questions. And your papers, you should already be working on them, but remember, any subject, any topic, hopefully everyone's already well into the writing. Um, and you remember to have 3 sources, new ones at least, in the bibliography, one of which should have been originally a printed source. Let me get the gallery view going here. Or speaker, I meant speaker view. Uh, and then also to use endnotes, because the 2 papers, actually they were both from this class, that I got as samples that I've responded to, just one of them this morning, uh, they didn't have citations, have fully complete citations, or one of them had none in the text, not just the bibliography, because that's, only a list of works that you used, that you read for this research for this paper. So in-text citations are pretty important. And then I've been saying this every week now, but it doesn't hurt to do it one more time, and I'll probably do it again on Wednesday. This is the format. So far, the sample papers I've gotten have all followed this, and that's really a good sign that hopefully everyone will do so. Because if you don't, your paper could go astray, and I wouldn't be sure which class it was from, or it might not even get logged in, and you don't want that. Plus which it's easier to keep track, obviously, once the grades come back from my readers and I alternate back and forth. I guarantee I'll grade at least one each of your papers or tests myself, and double check and confirm any readers grading. I don't just log them in once I get them back. But this is the way that I and my readers need to see the blue box. I don't know what you guys call that, which identifies the attachment as a PDF, of course, right? All documents have to be sent. The JCs requires that. And this is, of course, our 1.2. And then just, no space, short paper number 1, underline, and then last name, first name. And I guess you should have a comma in between. That's it. If you do it that way, the papers will guarantee to be logged in correctly and not get misplaced or misunderstood. Did I see someone about to start playing a violin? I thought I did. I've
And
never had,
Mark,
I've
I
had
had a couple
musical
questions.
accompaniment twice. In all the semesters I've taught Zoom, we were serenaded by someone on their guitar once, and that was very pleasant. And it was soft and gentle. And then when the slides started, I had to ask them to put the guitar away. Okay, anybody have any questions now? Is the time to ask about anything I just mentioned? Your papers, how to, make
Yeah,
sure you
Mark, I have a couple of questions.
Sure, go ahead.
First, a small one. The cover sheet you gave us, you want us to put that as the top sheet or the last
Yes.
sheet on the paper?
Oh yeah, thank you for reminding me to remind everyone else. That is really important. Yeah, that's how they'll get graded. Either filled in electronically, or in my case, I print them out. Don't ask me why, but my old mainframe Dell computer with Word 10, 2010, whatever it is, doesn't somehow allow me to fill in electronically. So I print out that cover sheet from each of the papers I grade that are coming from an online class, and hand print the scores for each section. So if you ever need to see those, I'll have the
I'm sorry,
ability
so
to
you,
send
you
them to
want
you.
you want that to be the top sheet, is that correct?
Yes, and try. Thank you. Also, try, please. Some people have trouble with this, but most of you should be able to attach them into a single PDF file so that it all comes together. That
Yeah.
the first page of that file is the cover sheet, right?
Yeah, okay. And then my second question
Sure.
is, in the footnotes, in the body of the paper, I just use numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in
That's
the
fine.
bibliography, I have the full citation. Is that correct?
You could do it that way, but it shouldn't be in the bibliography. The bibliography is a separate thing from the citations. So either you can do it at the bottom, but that's kind of cumbersome because then you,
Yeah.
right. That's the old way of doing it in a lot of college. If you could do a thesis for a BA, let alone a master's, you'll probably have to do that. But you can do them, it's called end notes, where you do all of them at the end of the paper, associated with the number, from within the text.
Okay.
Then a separate section of your paper at the very last part. Well, your illustration could be last. That's all right. It doesn't matter if you put the illustration at the end or the beginning, but the bibliography is the last part of your text, and that's labeled bibliography, and that's just that list. It's, of course, supposed to be the format, right? MLA format.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Thank you.
then that means if you do that and you do end notes, the end notes will probably be, after your last sentence in the body of your paper, if you want to do it that way, if you don't want to do traditional footnotes. Okay, I hope that's clear. Remember, you have the option of just doing in the parentheses. I don't have the sample paper, but I sent everyone a sample paper as a PDF about 2 weeks ago, which is to just list the last name of an author, okay, which would then, here we go. Yeah, we're just finishing up talking. You haven't missed anything. We're talking about the paper requirements. So in other words, if you want to do the simplest method, it's in parentheses. Either if it's a website, it's the full URL and the title of the article from that website, not just Wikipedia, right? In parentheses at the end of that fact, that quote, whatever, in the body of your paper. Or if it's a book or magazine, newspaper, it'll have an author. So the last name of the author and the page number where you got that fact. You could do it that way. That's called in-text citations. So, but the way you said it sounds like you're going to do it, it would be endnotes, and that's fine. I think that's even acceptable for graduate studies now, instead of traditional footnotes at the end of each page. You notice when you read book, probably nobody knows, but anybody read books anymore, hard copies, like I still do, you'll see that footnotes now are done in a way that the numbers aren't in the body of the paper or of each page. I meant to say in the text from the book itself, the printed book. You just have to guess which line they go with, and they're numbered by chapter at the end in order, but it isn't always obvious. I don't know why not. So if you're doing it with the number at the end of the fact, you're doing a step above what some publishers require, and I think that would be a good thing for future if you're going to go to four-year university, right, for BA, let alone graduate school. You'll probably be required to do something more specific. And some of these lazy editors, I don't know who it is that made that decision. Like I'm reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin, almost done with it. Got it for Christmas that long ago. And it's like that. It has hundreds of footnotes, of course, and each chapter dozens, but they don't put the number of the footnote of the fact from where that, that source was taken. Uh, in in any part of the text. You just have to guess. Oh, so that fact came from so forth. Yeah, that isn't really a good academic practice. So, for what it's worth, yeah, it's what you said you're going to do sounds perfect. Okay, as long as you keep it separate from the bibliography. Okay, any other questions? Now, it's a good time to ask because your paper's being due on Wednesday. I could ask, I mean, answer a few more of your questions, but it's kind of late then to make any changes. Hopefully, you'll have them done and submitted before class and had it off your plate so you can then pivot to finishing the last set of notes, and we'll talk about the midterm, how it's going to be graded, because it's 2 weeks from today, as I recall. Let's see, let's give you the exact date. Um, okay, yeah, it's Monday. Actually, it's 1 week from today. Monday the 27th. Right. So we're going to talk about how to. We spend most of the next class focusing on the how the midterm is going to be given and how it's graded and how to study for it, and cut down that list of all the slides from the original syllabus by at least 40%. I believe is what I put in writing. Pretty sure that's what it was. Yeah, or at least 30%, probably more. So then you won't have to even think about it. Plus, it's an open book test by definition, of course. Open note and open book. Okay, any other questions? Now's the time to ask about anything we just discussed relating to the papers, extra credit, or Baroque art. If you weren't here for the Baroque lecture, you want to watch that video on YouTube, which I posted a week ago, Friday, I think, with the definition of what makes something Baroque, because at least one, probably two slides on the midterm will be a Baroque art. Okay, so let us now go to our first, or yeah, it is our first slide for today. And let's get rid of this and move it up. Okay, now the next must know isn't this. I often do this because if you have some background, the meaning is a little easier, or it should be at least easier to understand. That's what you should be doing on your papers, of course. You're not only going to say, well, this is a scene from such and such. Hopefully, you're going to add something about the life of the artist if you haven't already, or that style of art, or the reason it was created. That's called context. As you know by now, I've been doing that every week during these lectures. So we start out with that. Here we go. This one is not the first must know, but it's by the same artist. This is a portrait of Saint James, is one of the disciples of Jesus from the Bible. And the artist's name, I'll go ahead and give you the title of the first must know because it's only 2 slides from now. Charles I. I'll go ahead and show it to you so you can see where, there it is. It's the very next slide. But I want to give you a little, like I said, context first. Charles I is the title of our first must know today. That's Roman numeral 1, right? Charles I. The artist's name is Van Dyck. 2 words being Dutch, they usually spell their last names with like Van Gogh, right? VAN and then capital DYCK, 1635. Okay, so you should start taking notes on the meaning because it's part of who was the artist. Van Dyck was considered the greatest one, or just say one, just keep it simple, one of the most successful and one of the best or greatest of all portrait painters in the Baroque era, because he was commissioned by kings, queens, and other wealthy or royal clients to paint their portraits. He was commissioned again by kings and queens and royal family members and wealthy collectors to do their portraits because he was so uniquely skilled. Now, by the way, quick aside for those of you who haven't been to a museum and want to use that option for extra credit, you can do that twice. Remember, 10 points each time. The only museum in the Bay Area that has any of this world-class quality of, quote, Western art, i.e. paintings, is the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. They have 2 Van Dyck portraits not this one. This is from Boston. So that would be one reason to go. They also have a Rembrandt and a Rubens. So they've got the Baroque room, I guess, with I think it's 2 dozen paintings. Right there, there's 4 or 5 world-class works of art. By the way, 3 of them were stolen through the skylight in the 1980s, and they were gone for like 15 years, and they were returned around, I think it was around 2000 or maybe early aughts. I think anonymously. That's an interesting subtopic. You could probably find a documentary. If you did, you could watch it and write about that. Another 10 points, extra credit. So well, I'll say it again for your first fact about the meaning of the must know. The next slide. Who was Van Dyck? He was considered one of the greatest and definitely the most successful of all the portrait painters in Europe at that time. This is a portrait of St. James from the Bible. And why I took this slide and why I'm showing it to you is look at his expression. Look at obviously he's on the verge of tears. It's because he knew that he had, quote, betrayed or not defended, right, his teacher, Jesus, right, that who had obviously already been, by the time this portrait is portraying him, had already been crucified. And he felt guilt and remorse for that. I think it's a brilliant portrayal of that kind of emotion. But what's amazing here, whoops, whoa, what is that doing there? Let's go to here. What's this on his shoulder? That looks to some artists, and I would include as an art historian, like an early example of an impressionist brushstroke. It's definitely the impression of what light would be if he had white under, a shirt under his red robes, how it might look to an impressionist painter. And it's even somewhat on his hand, on the knuckles, to some degree. You see what some people consider him to be one of the other artists. We covered this, remember, at the end of the last lecture, the Maids of Honor by Velázquez had a similar kind of set of almost impressionistic brush strokes on the face of the little princess in that painting. So both Velázquez and Van Dyck are considered to have been, some people think of them 200 years ahead of their time when it came to some of those things. But now we're going to talk about the meaning of this painting, which is very juicy. Who was Charles I? Well, if you don't know, you need to write this. He was King of England in the early to mid 16, just say in the first half of the 1600s, right? During the Baroque era, but you want to be more specific. He was King of England in the first half of the 1600s, and he believed in the divine right of kings. There really isn't any other way to write it. In fact, that would be capitalized back then. The kings who believed in it, including him, thought God, and what does that mean? God made them king, and no one should dare question anything they said or did. In other words, they had absolute authority because God gave it to them. Again, that's the phrase was the divine right of kings, capital D-R-K, right? It's a phrase that was used by royal families and some of their followers and defenders to justify any act that a king wanted to carry out, no matter how corrupt or how oppressive. So what did he do? Well, he believed in that divine right of kings, so he disbanded Parliament. There was a Parliament, been around for hundreds of years, right? And they were beginning to get some power, a little bit of power over when the king could declare war or tax. So he didn't like that. He wanted, to raise taxes. I believe that was the reason. And they didn't want to go along with it. So he sent soldiers into Parliament. I mean, that's a pretty brash act, and forced them to go home at the point of his sword. Well, guess what? One of them was named Oliver Cromwell. You may have heard of him. Pretty important man in the history of, freedom, or what do you want to call it? Rebellions against monarchs. And he led a rebellion, a civil war, they call it, the English Civil War, against this king and overthrew him. Now, that would be the end of the story if it wasn't for the fact that Charles didn't accept exile. He could have taken his jewels and his clothes and his furniture and his life and his family's life and many of his servants and gone safely to France. They would have let him do that, but he wouldn't. He raised another army and tried to overthrow Parliament a second time. And that time, when he was defeated, he was beheaded. The first time in the history of Europe that maybe in the world, that a popular rebellion, I'll repeat this, is a major part of the meaning of this painting, first time in the history of, at least to say Western history, that a king had been overthrown by a popular rebellion and then executed for treason because of his second, attempt to overthrow Parliament. So he lost his head over his own ego. That's one simplistic but not inaccurate way to put that. Okay, so here he is before all this. This is before the rebellion of the first Parliament and later his beheading. And it depicts him the way Van Eyck saw him, which is not flattering, but he didn't understand that. His ego just screams at you here because look at his arrogant pose, the way he's got his hands and his, arms are posed and his, entire tilt of his head and his expression. But as if his pose and his facial features aren't enough to convey intense ego and, a sense of, entitlement, if you want to call it that. Look at these servants. These servants cannot even look at him. They have to look away from him because they're lowly servants. They don't dare put their eyes on the king. I mean, this is probably partly accurate, but it's also an exaggeration that the painter is conveying his contempt for a king who paid him to paint his portrait. He was the royal court painter, is the point. That Van Dyck was hired to do this for several years. And for a while, he lived in one of the royal palaces, I'm not sure which one, and painted these paintings, these portraits of the king and his family. And he did not hide the fact, but the king didn't get it. His ego was so big, he just didn't see that he was being criticized in the way the portrait portrayed him. But as if all that's not enough, by the way, this one here looks like, it's a little sad note. This guy here looks to me like a young Charlie Watts. Oh, well, anyway, rest in peace, Charlie. This is his horse. This is the king's horse, of course. Even the horse, this is deliberately satirical here. This is not accurate, I'm sure. The horse, according to this portrait, is so, inferior to the king, even if it's his favorite, mount, favorite pet, whatever, favorite animal. He can't look the king in the eye. No one can because the king is too glorious. He's God's agent on earth. This was meant to be a criticism of the concept of divine right of kings. And in the end, that attitude is what cost this man his life. And some would say, a lot of blood lost because hundreds of thousands of people died in their civil war. It went on for like 6 years, longer than ours. Okay, so in the end, his son became king again after Cromwell died. But in the meantime, he lost everything, literally everything, because of his arrogance. All right, that's pretty much the whole meaning. It's Baroque because, of course, of the details. Look at the horse's mane, the leaves on the tree, the rocks on the path here. They're somewhere around the lakes section of England. They call it Lake District. And his clothing, right, there's a lot of detail. The bulbous look would have to be on, well, somewhat on the leaves of the trees and the clouds, but mostly on the clothing and his hat, of course. And then we have of course, unseen presence is supposedly God anointing him, right? God's authority, if you want to put it that way, giving him the power to do whatever he wants. So he thought. And then finally, the intense emotion is arrogance, clearly, total self absorbed arrogance on the part of a man who didn't understand why when he was led to the executioner, he still thought they would relent. The last minute, people were cheering when his head fell into the bucket. They didn't have a guillotine, you understand. This is before the French Revolution. They chopped his head off. And as he was led out to see the executioner standing there with the axe in his hand, he said, "You're not," he didn't say "you're not serious," but some phrase to that. He couldn't believe it. He still was clueless that late. Okay, formal analysis. Balanced? I would say so, because to me, even though this servant's head is lower than the king's, if you add the tree trunk and at least the lowest branch, it feels roughly balanced to me. But then a lot of people feel, well, there's a sky over here. So I wouldn't argue if you thought that it was somewhat unbalanced toward the right. Top to bottom, again, you be the judge. To me, it feels roughly balanced, depending on where you draw the midline here. There's obviously the rhythm of the arms, hands, heads, legs, the tree branches, the rocks, and the path. And then it has scientific perspective, and this is atmospheric perspective here, you see on the lake in the distance. No question that that's what we're seeing. And it has, of course, overlapping and foreshortening on the path, right, and diminishing size on the plants and rocks and trees as they fade into the distance. Here it's mostly warm colors, except for his satin jacket and the clouds. Most everything else is pretty much warm in the background, definitely, and on most of the clothing, the two servants and the horse's mane. Thin outline is everywhere. The largest mass, well, it's the king, and then his horse, and then you might say the top part of the tree, because we only see a part of that tree trunk, and then maybe this closest servant. The modeling and semi texture, it's a given. Remember, with that one, the clothing, the hair, the skin, the landscape around them, the trees and rocks, is always in any. Remember, Baroque can be considered late Renaissance, so anything from the 14th to the late 1600s is going to have super sharp, realistic, simulated textures and modeling on all the objects, especially noticeable on his clothing here. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. The next artist, must-know artist, is one I admire greatly because of his choice of subjects. And we'll do the same thing here. This is the must-know. But before we get to that, again, a little context. So it's part of the meaning you should have in your notes in case the next must-know, La Bohemienne, I'll spell that for you, two words, La, of course, L-A, and then capital Bohemienne, La Bohemienne, Hals, Hals, 1636. Okay, that's this one. As I said, it's a woman. Well, that name, if you know anything about Latin-based languages, is going to be a female name, or word, I should say, which would have to do with someone from the Bohemian lifestyle. A few of you know the play Rent. Well, they made a movie of it too, right? And that's a song in that movie. It's actually one of the best music numbers in many years. La vie bohemienne, right? The Bohemian life. Well, we'll get to the meaning of that in a minute. But first, who was Hals is part of the meaning of the must know. Of course, he was one of the most successful portrait painters, not quite as famous as Van Dyck. Van Dyck was known all over Europe, but in Holland, Hals, Hals, his last name, was very successful. And he was very popular too because he painted all kinds of people. That's the point I want to get across about the must know that's just about to come up now. Now here is a rich. You got to by the way he's dressed. He's a rich, probably a merchant who's made a lot of money in some kind of business, and he actually thinks of himself as a painter. Someone that no one would remember today, I'm sure, except a few historians. But look at his jacket. Something similar to what we saw with the Van Dyck portrait and the Maids of Honor with Velasquez, almost impressionistic type brush strokes on the sleeve where the light's hitting this, it's blue crushed velvet, I'm guessing. So again, you could say Hals is one of those painters from the 1600s, from the Baroque era, who experimented with ways of depicting light on his subjects that almost were like a forerunner of Impressionism 200 years before. Now, here's the point I was making earlier about Hals. So this is another fact about him that has to do with the meaning of the must know. The very next slide is that. This is the Jolly Trooper. I took this slide. It's at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. I love this slide because this man was, by society standards, a loser. And so what does that have to do with the meaning of either this or the must know that's next? Hals was really unusual in that he would paint portraits of people who didn't have the money to pay him. They were not commissioned portraits. He wanted to capture the lives and living conditions, if you want to call it that, of the everyday people, including the down and out. That was very unusual. There's only one other painter in Northern Europe, at least, who consistently did that, and he's the main person we're covering today, and that's Rembrandt. Rembrandt did that his whole life. Hals also did. He would, when he needed to pay the rent, he paid rich people's portraits. Okay, so did Rembrandt. But Hals and Rembrandt were two of the very few painters, successful, famous painters in Northern Europe, who consistently throughout their careers chose to paint individuals from the lower classes. This guy had been a soldier. Trooper would mean, former soldier. And like a lot of soldiers, he probably suffered from all kinds of trauma after you see people die in front of you, and so he couldn't hold down a job or whatever. He was in an inn one day when Hall saw him performing, in essence, almost begging for his food, right? For a little bit of money to pay for food and rent. But look at his face. He may be considered a loser by the upper classes, of course, in Holland at that time. They definitely looked down on him, maybe even by the innkeeper who hired him or allowed him to play, to entertain his customers, and some of the customers even, but not by Halls. Halls didn't see him that way. He saw him as someone who was saying almost, well, I'm free and I'm doing something I enjoy. I like playing music, and maybe he wrote his own songs. So who's really the loser here? I'm not. In other words, I'm making a choice that I prefer to do this rather than, continue being a soldier or doing something I hated to survive. So now we get to the must know, okay? So this is a woman that some historians think they can identify, but nobody knows for sure. We'll just say that she was a lower class, probably a washerwoman or servant, in an inn, maybe both, possibly. Uh, who, again, Hall saw her and decided he wanted to paint her portrait just for his own interest to capture this type of lifestyle and to show it with dignity. That may be the best phrase to use. Yeah, I sort of implied that, right, with the portrait of the soldier, the Jolly Trooper. Definitely in this one he did, because she was really looked down on. She would have been considered the scum of the earth. They may not have used that word. I don't know what the Dutch phrase would be, but the lowest of the low, because she was homeless. Undoubtedly, she had probably come from an abusive background. She definitely wouldn't have been able to, make a choice in many parts of her daily life, except that she still has a sense of her own self worth and dignity, and she still has some kind of integrity. So even if she's working at the lowest paying job in the worst dive in Amsterdam or anywhere in Holland, wherever the city was that he painted it, he, the painter, the artist, doesn't look down on her. He's showing her with honesty, accuracy, and dignity. Things that weren't common at all for most painters in that period, of course, because they had to cater to the upper classes, or the middle classes at least. They could afford to pay them. And he captures that state of mind, even though she's living by the title alone. We know she's probably homeless, or temporarily living in some place, and then we'll have to move because she can't afford the rent anymore. Or she's with someone who might be abusive and finally gets tired of it and moves out. And she could even be manic depressive, we would say today, or bipolar. There's some people who think that that's part of what he's trying to convey here. Someone who is, obviously, therefore, really considered an outcast, right? We talked about this with the Albrecht Dürer engraving, remember, of right? Melancholy, right? One where he was pleading for understanding for people with mental, inherited or otherwise, mental illness or suffering from mental breakdowns, that we should understand and sympathize with them, not abuse them. And that's certainly how, even though this is 100 or so years later, Halls was thinking about the people he portrayed. If some of them undoubtedly were suffering from some kind of trauma, maybe that soldier, for instance, from PTSD or something like that, he empathized with them. He related to them, and he did not in any way portray them as losers or the rejects of society. He just wanted to capture them in an honest, dignified way. I admire that. Okay, formal analysis. Look at the background. This should surprise a few people here. That is a very modern looking background. I mean, where is she? Is she inside an inn where she might be working? Is she, in a hallway of an apartment or a canal house in Amsterdam where she's, barely able to pay for a room per night or something? Or maybe it's in his studio. We don't know. We don't need to, because he doesn't want us to focus on what's around her. He wants us to focus on her, particularly her face. So the background is very indistinct, but she is soft modeling. Look at this again, almost impressionistic feeling around her blouse there. And even to some degree, parts of her, at least her forehead anyway, there. But otherwise, it's fairly realistic modeling, of course, on her face and her hair, but on her clothing, it isn't. And warm colors, of course, on her skin and her dress, and then on her, I guess it's the blouse, right? It would be, of course, cool, and then neutral on her hair. It is dynamic, even though most portraits, when you see just the upper half of someone standing upright, well, she could be sitting, we don't know yet, would at least be stable primarily because of the upright pose, but not in her case. She's tilting, deliberately looking at someone over on the side, somewhere outside our view. And that would mean that this is a very overall dynamic. Of course, the lines of her clothing and her hair are dynamic. There's very soft outlines, but mostly they are implied. Look carefully. Around her face, yes, there's outlines on the features of her face. But her clothing, there really isn't much outline. It's all done with modeling, which is soft and diffused, as is the simulated texture on her clothing, whereas up in the upper half from her neck up is realistic modeling and simulated textures both. The rhythm is obvious. Her hair, her eyes, her arms, parts of her clothing. For space, all we have is overlapping and maybe a little foreshortening on her shoulders. I see some of that. Okay, and then she's the single largest mass. There really is no other mass here. And then the only technique for space is overlapping. Her clothes overlap her body, and I guess you could say her body overlaps the background, even though we don't know what that background is. Okay, let's move on to, I use this, the artist of the hour, the man or woman of the hour, meaning the most important person to make sure you get very thorough notes for the two, and there are two must knows, I believe I did, unless I cut that down. I don't, yeah, there are two of Rembrandt that you really want to take extra careful notes on. Okay, this isn't the must know, it's a self-portrait of Rembrandt, but once again, if all I do is show must knows, I notice every so often I'll have someone say, why don't you just stick to the slides on the syllabus? Well, then you're just teaching to the textbook. And that's, to me, not as informative and illuminating, hopefully, as something a little more broadly context. So who was Rembrandt? Well, Rembrandt was, of course, the most famous Baroque painter. Nobody would argue with that. Now he is. During his lifetime, he was successful. It would be overstating it to say he wasn't well known, but he often was barely able to pay rent. Yeah. And here we go. Yeah. You're just in time to see the start of the most important two slides coming up, and that's Rembrandt. So we just started with who was Rembrandt. I'll just briefly state he was well known and successful as a painter in Holland. He was from Amsterdam, or well, that's where he lived when he worked. But there's something else about him that I don't think most people realize. He often went hungry and he lost everything he had earned or gained in the middle of his life, or the middle of his career, I should say, which means around 40 or so. And I'll tell you how. It has to do with the meaning of the first must know. This is a self-portrait while he was on the way up. So it's Rembrandt's self-portrait when he was 28 years old. And what do you notice about his face, other than that it's a typical Rembrandt lighting technique? In fact, that's exaggerated by the whoever reproduced the slide. It doesn't have that bright a spot, but you see a spotlight effect, right? We talked about this on his shoulder, which he, of course, was influenced by Caravaggio. We talked about that, how Caravaggio, the first great Baroque painter in the calling of St. Matthew, introduced that technique, invented it, the spotlight effect. So that's nothing new, but he carries it, Rembrandt carries it to a whole new level. Here, the parts that are in shadow are what we're really supposed to notice more than what's lit, because his eyes give away the state of mind, which anybody here looking at this, can you, there's no right or wrong here. What do you think would be in his mind, the way he's looking at us in this self-portrait? What do you think he was feeling or thinking? He's in his 20s. He finally became, look at his cap with this fancy feather and gold. Clearly he's successful now at a fairly early age in his 20s. Even back then, that's still pretty early for him to reach the, height of a career that's very competitive. Painting there were a lot of people trying to make a living painting in Amsterdam then. But what do you think his expression, I'll get up close again, tells us about how he was thinking about himself? Anybody?
To me, he looks like he's like pleasantly surprised with the outcome.
Yes, exactly. Yes, he is surprised at his own success. And I'm not sure if it's a pleasantly surprised or just surprised, but either way, yes, that's the main point. He definitely didn't expect that much success that early. But that's only the beginning of the story of what he went through to achieve his best work. A self-portrait, can be great, but you can't call them a masterpiece usually because you know your subject and you stand in front of a mirror. You can guarantee the pose is going to be the one you want. You know what I mean? So isn't that one of his most famous paintings? But yes, absolutely. So you could say that he was surprised by his own early success, and it shows in many of his early self-portraits. So let's move on now to this one, which is a bloody, gory scene from the Bible. It's not the must-know. The blinding of Samson. Now, Samson, some of you know, was supposed to be a super strong guy who eventually pulls down the pillars of a temple and kills himself and everyone in it as vengeance for having been blinded. And Delilah stole his hair, and his hair, there it is in her hand, is what gave him his strength. According to the Bible. You have to write this now. I'm just saying this is a typical scene of that Rembrandt would paint just for his own interest, because no one commissioned this. Scenes from history or the Bible. They're called history paintings, or you could just say religious or biblical paintings, which is nothing new. That had been done for a couple hundred years since the early Renaissance. But he gave him a special intensity with that spotlight effect, and I don't know if you can see there's blood spurting out of his eye socket here, where his eyes are being gouged out. He was blinded by those soldiers. They're supposed to be Roman soldiers. They're dressed like soldiers from the 1600s, but other than that, it's a fairly accurate interpretation of a scene from the Bible. Now, this you want to start taking notes, because this and the must know go together as far as the meaning. This will be this slide, which is I'll give you the title. Let's do that now, so you have it ready to fill in when we get to this slide. Just two words: night watch. Night watch. This is a slide I'm not cutting from the study list. It's really important. Rembrandt is, of course, Rembrandt, 1642. Okay, we'll get to this in a minute, but start taking the notes about the meaning, because before he did that painting that made him immortal, that painting is the most famous painting by almost any Baroque painter, and certainly Rembrandt, of all his paintings. And that's saying a lot, because he did a lot of great paintings. Before he did his best work, just keep it simple, he was doing corporate group portraits and hating it with a passion. For instance, this famous painting, it's pretty famous, called The Anatomy Lesson, which was supposedly a bunch of young medical students. Look at their faces. These guys aren't most of them are over 50. Look at them. I don't think they're young medical students. In fact, we know they're not. Maybe one or two, possibly. But the point is that they are not in any way, just, studying anatomy. They are a board of directors of an HMO. Now, if that doesn't surprise you, nothing should today. Were HMOs? Well, no, of course, they didn't literally have HMOs, but they had private subscription and insurance policies, because there was no public healthcare, none, zero, right? So if you were middle class, you could subscribe to a hospital, and then they take care of you when you or your family got sick. So it's kind of an HMO, and they're the board of directors of a corporation. They were literally corporations. The Dutch invented corporations, by the way, as you may know, and the stock market, they invented that too. So there was a stock market, and these people had investments, and they wanted to be shown as, somehow knowledgeable. Maybe when they were 30 years younger or 20 years younger, they studied actual anatomy, but not now. They probably haven't picked up a knife in 2 decades or more. So he would paint them with equal spotlight effect. You see, that's the main point on each of their faces. Keep that in mind, because that will be the counterpoint to the must know we're going to get to in about 2 minutes, including this guy is a doctor. He was actually a famous doctor, and that was probably something that they came to watch. A dead, probably homeless person, they would call them a pauper. They would, of course, often had such anatomy lessons, but these are not young medical students. These are, as I said, the board of directors of a private medical hospital, and they want to show themselves off. And so he did what they asked, and he got paid well, and he didn't enjoy that process. He did that for a few years, built up, enough to buy a decent place to live and, have plenty of, material. It's expensive things for painting, right? The canvases and, to pay models, and of course the paint itself, and to raise, get married and have a couple of children. And then what happened? Everything went to hell. He painted this painting. Here we go. This is really why this painting is considered a seminal work of art. in his career, it changed everything for him in his personal life and his professional life. And it helped change the type of portrait painting that Western artists had been doing. How and why? Because this isn't the same thing at all. Look carefully, and what you see is a group of private militiamen. There was no police force this far back, no public safety, paid for by the city government or anything. It was all private, mercenary type, um, militia types. And they would go out and patrol, of course, the neighborhoods that were well off enough to pay them. So they're getting ready to go out in at night watch. It's probably the midnight shift, in the dead of night, to of course watch over the well-to-do people's homes in a nice neighborhood. And when he painted this, they all thought that it would get equal treatment on their faces. They would all have equal lighting, and it would be shown, like across the front, and maybe two rows. That's a standard portrait, group portrait. We just saw that with those, corporate doctors, so-called, in the anatomy lesson. That's not what's happening here. Let's start with the fact that some of the people you can't even see. There's this guy's face is completely blocked by this man's arm. And then we have them fading in the distance here. And the only people fully bodied views of any of are these three guys in the front, the guy in red, black, and white. They were probably the officers. They got the treatment they might have expected. But look at how dark it gets toward the back and how their bodies are mostly obscured. They're not looking directly at us. He was painting an honest moment of confusion when they all arrived for the midnight shift, or whatever, say the evening shift, and they had to grab their weapons and go out on patrol. And the clamor of the weapons against each other, these are right heavy pole. They would have made a sound with, wood against wood or metal against wood. And of course, here they are, loading their muskets, and that make all of this noise and clamor he captured brilliantly. But what he didn't do was cater to their egos. That's the short way to say it. He refused on this portrait, for the first time of any group portrait by any famous painter that I can think of, certainly in Holland, to cater to or to stroke the egos equally, because each one of these people paid an equal amount of money to have themselves portrayed with equal importance. They expected that. So what happened? Well, when they all came to see him unveil this portrait, which is huge, it's as big as a wall. By the way, it's in the Amsterdam Museum now, and it has a whole wall to itself. These are life-size figures, in other words. They hated it. They refused to pay him anything because it wasn't what they thought he was going to do for them, which was give them all this equal treatment with their full body view and, just static, standing still looking, like they were important, equally important. They absolutely, not only did they reject this painting, this group, this militia, private militia, but they went around Amsterdam and said, don't hire Rembrandt anymore. He's lost it. He can't paint group portraits anymore, which is how he made, as I said, most of his income in the first half of his career. So guess what happened? He lost most of his clients, almost all his income. Then he lost his house, and then he even lost his own paintings. The Dutch government seized him because he was bankrupt. And so he had to literally steal a few of his own paintings and go to the country. So a few of them he could still keep. And his wife had just died, so he was, a widower. It was a very difficult time in his life. In other words, he sacrificed all of his success for artistic integrity. To me, that speaks highly of someone when they're willing to risk everything to not go with the flow, right? Or not just do what they were told or expected to do by the rulers or the upper, whatever you want to say, the wealthy clients. He did something creative and original, and these people wouldn't even be known today if it wasn't for that fact. We wouldn't know who all these people are, but now we do because of his original approach. So this is absolutely a seminal work of art. It broke new ground. It's considered his masterpiece, and it influenced group portrait painting from that period on by other European painters. But he suffered for it. Okay, let's do the formal analysis. It's balanced. Oh yeah, that he did do. Although some people think that nobody knows who that woman is too. That's one last fact you could write about the meaning. Some people think it's his deceased wife. Other think it's his mother or the wife of one of the militia officers. No one's ever been able to pin down who she's. You just say a mystery woman. why would a woman be sitting there in the middle and then lit up like that? That's another thing they were upset about. They don't remember her posing for it. So who knows how she got into the portrait, but he chose to include this mystery woman. Okay, well, it is dynamic. The only thing stable, you might say, this guy here is mostly, but even he is kind of a diagonal to, well, certainly to the musket. But almost every other figure is their bodies, their upper bodies, at least what we can see of them, are at a diagonal or tilted or leaning over. And then maybe the back wall, maybe just that is the only stable thing. Totally. It's almost entirely dynamic. For space, you have overlapping, foreshortening, of course, on the floor and some of the men's shoulders, right? And then you have, of course, diminishing size for the figures. There is probably a vanishing point. Scientific perspective, we couldn't see it, of course, because the vanishing point would be outside the back wall. There's no atmospheric perspective, of course. And then it's a mixture of warm and cool. Well, this guy's neutral here with the colors of his clothing, of course. But most of the figures are, either cool like this gentleman's white tunic or this one's red, warm tunic. And then alternating, of course, the skin tones are all warm, and the walls in the back are. Simulated texture, again, it's gonna be realistic and fairly sharp and strong on the face, the hair, the clothing, the weapons. The same thing with the modeling. The rhythm is obvious with all the figures, the parts you can see of the ones in front, obviously 2 hands, 2 arms, 2 legs, and all the heads and at least some arms in the background, all the weapons sequence. I don't know about other people. When I see this painting, even a print like this or a slide, let alone the original, I've been to Amsterdam 4 times. I always go to that museum. It's incredible. It's called the Rijks, as in the State Museum, not the German meaning of the word that Hitler used, but it's the same word. It just means State Museum. And Rembrandt's best paintings are in that. Some of his best paintings, many of them. And I can hear these weapons clanking against each other, and the shouts and the commotion. I mean, it's brilliant in that. It captures a moment better than any group portrait ever had before. And let's see. Oh, the largest mass. Well, you decide that one. Maybe it's the wall, if you count that as a single mass, or it's these 2 guys because they're the largest figures in front of us, or maybe even the floor, and then these 2 men, and then possibly the flag. And the lines here are thin outlines. And it's roughly balanced, I would say, left to right, but unbalanced toward the bottom because of all the empty space up above them. All right, the other Rembrandt must know is one he painted during his last few years when he was living in poverty or near. I mean, sometimes he would get a commission and he'd earn enough, to pay rent for 6 months, but he had lost, as I just said, almost everything he had earned in his early career because of the reaction to that painting and his willingness to risk everything for his artistic integrity. So this painting is during that period after he had done the Night Watch, near the end of his life. It's 3 words, The Jewish Bride. And it's Rembrandt. I've already spelled Rembrandt right. Remember, it ends with an A-N-D-T. Rembrandt, 1665. So he moved into a poor neighborhood in Amsterdam. First, he had to leave Amsterdam because he knew if he stayed there, what was left, his house was being possessed, and paintings were being claimed by creditors, and the city government of whatever, just the authorities, you can say, were taking his paintings as collateral because he had debts he couldn't pay since his income dropped so drastically. So he managed to salvage a few of his favorite paintings and moved to the country, but he couldn't make a living there. So he moved back to Amsterdam the last several years of his life. That's when this was painted. This is the part of the meaning here you should be writing. And he lived in or near the Jewish ghetto. Amsterdam had a large Jewish population, more than most European cities, because they were more tolerant. Some parts of Europe, they wouldn't let the Jews come after they were kicked out of Spain. Some of you know this, right? By Queen Isabella, the one that and Ferdinand sent Columbus across the ocean, right? After they took the rest of Spain from the Moors, right? Some of you know this, that had been the Muslim rulers for centuries. They then required everyone remaining in Spain, whether they had been Muslim or Jewish, to convert or leave. And so many Jews just left. And a large number of them went to Amsterdam because it was a prosperous city and they could start over and they were welcomed. But it wasn't the wealthy part of town. There were some nice houses in some parts of it, just like, many big cities, districts, different districts do. But where he lived was not one of the wealthy areas. of the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. And so he painted for a modest commission, probably enough for a few months' food and rent. This couple, they'd been married for maybe 50 years, just say decades. Their kids were grown. They had what is, of course, one phrase you could use, I think, mature love for each other that had been tested through decades of living together and all the things that a married couple and parents would have to go through to get to this point in their relationship. Obviously, they have a deep, abiding love. So that's what this depicts. It's another small masterpiece. It's, by the way, on another wall by itself, side wall of that same museum. It's within sight of the one in Amsterdam, the Rijksmuseum, inside of the Night Watch. These two side by side, they kind of tell the story of what I'm telling you about how much had changed in his career, and yet he still managed to paint these wonderful portraits of people, as well as some scenes, history and biblical scenes, just for his own interest. So here he shows a mature couple having spent their whole adult lives together, practically decades, and they still really love each other and have a deep, abiding affection. And I think he captures it brilliantly. That's pretty much the whole meaning. Obviously, they're fairly well off, so they could probably, based on how they're dressed, pay him better than some of the other clients he might have painted who couldn't. And so maybe that particular commission got him, enough extra income to at least not worry about paying the rent for the next several months. And he did a lot of portraits of both poor, working class, homeless people, even he painted portraits of. So he had that in common with Hals. They knew each other way. Hals and Rembrandt really respected each other, but Hals never had that much hardship in his life. He was always successful. Rembrandt, as you know now, did. I don't think most people realize that. I mean, he got back to where before the end of his life, he wasn't worried about his, paying. I think he actually bought a house again with something he had saved, but it took him a long time to build back into where he could have his own private studio and a home that was secure. A long time after that debacle over the Night Watch. Okay, formal analysis. Balanced? Yeah, no question. I mean, her dress is wider, right? Maybe, but if you add his robes here and it's roughly balanced, even though her head is slightly lower than his. But he is a little bit larger mass. So if you feel it's because of that, I wouldn't argue if you felt it was somewhat or slightly unbalanced toward the left. The only techniques for space here are for shortening on the shoulders and overlapping, of course. We don't even know where they are. His background is not distinctive. We can't tell. There's, again, soft modeling, but realistic on the clothing. But I would say fairly sharp and realistic on their hands. He wants you to emphasize their gentle touches for each other and their faces. And then the outlines are thin. They always were in almost all of his paintings, most Baroque paintings. It's dynamic to a degree, but they are both, well, he is leaning over. So you could say it's a mixture. She's standing upright and at least part of her arms at a right angle. But because they're, and his right forearm where they're touching us. So it's both. Their heads obviously are dynamic and parts of their clothing. Colors warm almost everywhere. And that's not by accident. He's actually trying to convey the warmth between the two of them that they felt for each other in the skin tones and the colors on the clothing, the dress and his robes. Let's see. Now, what are we forgetting here? The largest mass. Balance, rhythm, stable, dynamic. The modeling is slightly, as I said, soft on parts, but strong on it. And the similar textures, they're always going to be realistic on his paintings, as most Baroque paintings are. Okay, so now.
A quick question about that one?
Sure, absolutely, yes.
So if this one's considered Baroque, I see the ornamentation and the bulbousness and whatnot, but how would you describe the unseen presence?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would guess it would be their past. That's a good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked for it. To make it Baroque, it would have that. I think it's their memories of their life together.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure. And then, of course, the intense emotion is a deep, abiding love. Right. Now, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Okay, so I'm going to say this quickly, but if any of you you have to write notes again. We'll do one more must know because we do have time, maybe two, and we'll end on time. And I'll stick around like I always do as long as need be for you to ask questions after 4:15. But don't put your notes away. We have at least one more must know. But you can put your pen down now or your laptop keyboard to the side for a second and just look at this. This is called the prodigal son. If you don't know the story, it's from the Bible, where a man has two sons and he gives them both an equal amount of money. And when they turn whatever, I don't know, they become an adult, let's say, turn 21 or whatever. And one of them spends all the money and then is homeless, disappears for 20 years because he blew the money his father gave him. This is the father and this is that son. Maybe that's obvious. He's homeless. Look at this. He's got lice literally in his hair. And look at his shoe. Well, there are no. He's barely got part of one shoe. Here's the son who didn't waste the money, who invested it and became a partner in his father's firm and is dressed nicely and stayed at home with his family and raised kids. And he's not exactly, look at his face. I don't know if he's, yeah, well, maybe he's not so thrilled to see his younger brother. But in any case, what you have here is this study in unconditional love from a parent to a child. And I can relate to it for one quick reason. I'm the oldest of four boys in my family. My parents had four sons. And my next youngest brother, we're all about 2 years apart, disappeared right after his 30th birthday. None of us heard from him for over 30 years. We thought he was dead. We just assumed. I'd look in the, different accounts of different, I hate to say it, morgues and things when I was back east, because the last we heard from him, he had hitchhiked his way to the East Coast, and he was seen somewhere in Providence, Rhode Island by one of his former band. He had a rock band for a while before he had manic depression, and he still does, bipolar. And he inherited it from my mother, unfortunately. So we didn't know if he was alive or dead. About 2.5 years ago, he contacted me through the SRJC faculty portal by email. And we've been in touch ever since. I had plans to go see him. And then the pandemic hit. So once it's safe to travel, and hopefully soon, I hope to see a long lost brother. And of course, I'm not going to be judgmental. I'm a little angry that he didn't try to contact us for all those years. But, that's what this is about: forgiveness and overcoming any kind of resentment you might feel if someone disappoints you, whether it's a friend or a family member, relative, whatever, an in-law. And unconditional love is the point he's trying to make. And I think this captures brilliantly. This is not long before he died. Rembrandt did this like a year before he died. 1666, I think it was. 69. Yeah, he died that year. In fact. Okay, now we get to one of those few women I mentioned. There were, in the Baroque era, there were women who were able to become successful painters, a larger number than ever before. There were some in the 1500s, but very few. There were several dozen in Europe, I'm talking about. And this is one of them. This is Self-Portrait, just like it sounds, the title, Self-Portrait. And the artist's name is Leicester, Leyster, 1635. So who was she? Well, first of all, for what it's worth, her name was Judith, and she was one of the most successful female artists. But see, that sounds kind of, qualifying. So I prefer to say portrait painters who also happened to be a woman in Northern Europe during her lifetime. She got commissions from all kinds of people, but she didn't usually do royal. I don't think she did any royal family portraits. She either chose not to, or that just wasn't, where her clients came from. But she did successfully paint, fairly, successful people, or, well off, and people could afford to, commission her work. But she did a series of self-portraits that are very revealing. Here she is looking at us saying, I really enjoy what I do. That's the message that she's trying to convey here. And this is her dressed as a man playing violin. I don't know if she actually did that. I don't know. There might be some research by now about her. There's whole books about her, actually, and books about women portrait painters of that period, or painters, period. I already mentioned, of course, Judith and the Maid Servant, right, by Artemisia. And that was last week. I think we saw that, right? And that's Gentileschi was her name, right? So there's an example of a woman overcame a rape and a betrayal by her own father and torture by the Inquisition. This woman didn't have that kind of thing to overcome, but that sexism was enough to have to deal with. But she became, she was friends with Halls. Halls admired her and talked up her work, but it isn't because of him that she became successful. She had the talent, and all he did was recognize, acknowledge it, and mention it. And so they became friends and supported each other and probably referred clients to each other. So that's another fact about her that you could put notes on the meaning of this. But my favorite thing is how she's so relaxed. She's just leaning back with one arm, perched on the back of her chair, looking at us in an obviously satisfied kind of, feeling without the slightest bit of, there's nothing smug here or, self-absorbed. I don't see any of that. She's just enjoying what she's doing, and she worked hard and had overcome the prejudice against women artists to get to this level, which she had achieved by this time. But I particularly like how she's painting a portrait of herself dressed as a man, having the same reaction, but in this case, performing as a musician, not a painter. So that's pretty much the whole meaning on this one. Okay, I think we'll do one more must know. So that will have more time to talk about the midterm, because you want that next week. So let's do this quick, and then one more must know, and then I'll stop to take questions. Okay, she is the largest mass, obviously. Then the easel, or of the painting she's doing, and then her palette. It is both dynamic and stable. I see her head is mostly stable, and her arm close to, but not quite at a right angle. But her upper body is leaning back, of course. And the figure she's painting is a mixture. So it's both stable and dynamic in different parts. Roughly balanced to me, top of her head, the top of the painting, right? On the easel, I'd say it's roughly balanced. And then we have the schematic textures, very realistic, especially on her skin, like even on her hand, definitely her face. And less so though on her dress and her palette and the sleeve of her dress. And look, there again, we get this slightly, almost impressionistic feeling, not quite as much as Van Dyck and Halls would have done. But there's some influence he probably had seen from his Halls, right, portraits. I'm sure they knew each other's work. And then we have the rhythm of the arms. Oh, well, in this case, you just see hands, right? And of course, the patterns on the part of her dress we can see in her collar. Look at that collar. Would get in the way of painting, I would think. And then, of course, on the modeling is strong and realistic, as it usually is in Baroque paintings, especially on her face and her hand, but everywhere else too. A little less so on the upper part of her dress. And let's see, for spaceship, overlapping and foreshortening. That's it. It looks like just the wall of her studio behind her, but there wouldn't be any scientific perspective here. I don't see diminishing size either. Warm colors on her skin, right? And at least, well, most of these, again, the upper parts of this other self-portrait and the background of it. Whereas the background of the room she's in, of course, and her collar and headdress are cool, and then her dress and palette are neutral. And mostly the lines are thin outlines. Okay, let's do one more. And that is woman holding a balance, just like it sounds, 4 words. Woman holding a balance, B-A-L-A-N-C-E. The artist's name is Vermeer, V-E-R-M-E-E-R, 1664. Well, I'll tell you what. I think what I'm going to do, because there's too much to say, and to be fair to you, to cram into 3 minutes, I said we'd end at 4:15. So what I'll do is just tell you who Vermeer was, and then we'll finish the meaning, okay? And the formal analysis on this is I won't be cutting this from the study list, by the way. It's Vermeer's, you've heard of him, I'm sure many of you. Maybe you've seen the movie with Colin Firth, right? And Scarlett Johansson called Girl with a Pearl Earring. That's based on one of his famous paintings. Vermeer, here we go. Here, just to keep it brief, to like 2 or 3 main facts about who he was, and then we'll stop the lecture part, and I'll take any questions you guys have. Vermeer was a successful but not well known. During his lifetime, he was not known outside of Holland, definitely not. So he was a successful local painter. That's how I put it. In a small town. He wasn't in Amsterdam. He was in a town called Delft. You don't have to know that, but it's one of the most beautiful towns I've ever been to. It's where they make the pottery. It's a tourist site now. It was in a small Dutch city, say, not like a country town. And so he wasn't probably known much beyond Holland at all. And he only produced about 70 paintings. That's not very many. He died in his mid 40s. And he was mostly a painter of interior domestic scenes. That's what you could summarize his themes of his paintings. That's what this is, and we'll talk about the meaning of this painting at the beginning of the next lecture. But he painted a series of domestic scenes, and he was a master of interior light. The way he portrayed light on the main objects inside those rooms was brilliant and unique and advanced beyond his years. So much so, some historians think he cheated. Not too many, but some other painters do. Some 21st century painters think he couldn't have done this realistically unless he had some kind of a camera, or some kind of optical device to get super sharp simulated textures. And we'll do the formal analysis course next week. So what does that tell us about him? He was extremely skilled, and portraits, of course, were an aspect of what he did. This obviously is a portrait of a woman, but there's more to it than that. There's a lot going on. We'll talk about at the beginning of the class on Wednesday as to what is happening with her and why she's standing at this table and what the state of mind she might be in based on her expression and her body language, or her physique, if you want to call it that. There's a lot to say about all that. But we've got ourselves right up to 4:15 now. So we're going to stop the lecture notes. So I will now take any questions anybody has about, your papers. Don't forget, they're due by midnight at the latest. If they arrive after midnight, they'll be 5 points off for being late. So hopefully you'll get them all in, but well before midnight. But anybody have any questions about anything relating to your papers, extra credit, or these Baroque slides we just covered? Anybody? So this is my office hour time, so it's your chance to ask questions. You can still send, if a couple people joined us late, so if you want to, you could still send me a sample of your paper for me to comment on, as long as you do it before the end of the afternoon, like not past 5 or even hopefully before that tomorrow. I could get back to you to give you, a little feedback as to whether you're missing anything. If you send it to me as a PDF, of course, so I can open it easily. Any questions?
Mark, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead. Yes.
But it's not about the what you shared with us. So just real quickly, I wanted to verify the chapters for the midterm. I know that's not out for a while. Can I ask you a question on that? You want to wait till
Sure.
next week?
No, that's okay. It could be helpful to other people too.
Cool. So in your outline, it says something like chapters 17, 18, 19, because we all have different
Yes.
copyright books.
Okay.
Can I just say, is that?
Go ahead. I think I know what you're about to ask.
Yeah. Is that 15th century art, Renaissance art, and 16th? Or
Okay.
what three
No,
chapters?
the exact chapter numbers in Stockstead is on the first page, which I think I only said toward the beginning of the semester. So it bears
sorry.
repeating. I will say it again. Don't always line up with depending on the edition you have. So notice the title of each lecture. So in other words, whatever sections in Stockstead, but really you can just study from the notes and get, if you really do a good job. Of course, you'll have them in front of you with the Herfkes' open book and open note. The textbook is really good for the images, matching them with, the notes, both from my lectures and the book, as to the meaning. The formal analysis you guys should be able to do on your own now, because you've been doing it, right? I hope you've almost finished the formal analysis on your papers. So in other words, it's covering everything from about 1400, early Renaissance, through Baroque, through the late 1600s. In other words, where each of these sets of slides are, that's what you need to focus on. So weeks, in other words, the slides from weeks 1, right? So don't be, sidetracked if you can, or distracted by the chapter numbers in Stockstead, all the way through week 6. So once again, it's weeks 1 through week 6, those slides that are on the syllabus. But you don't want to waste time studying yet, because you'll have 5 days. I'm going to cut that list down by 30 to 40% on Wednesday. So you all want to be here for that lecture, because then you don't waste time even thinking about slides that won't even be on the exam. Okay, I hope that answers your question. I understand why you're asking, but
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, that way you just focus on what's on the syllabus. Yeah. Okay, but that's what we're here for, so to clarify. Anybody else have any questions regarding anything relating to your papers, extra credit, midterm, or any of the slides we just covered?
I guess I have one. If
Sure.
no one-
Go ahead.
So I went to the Legion a couple weeks ago when the class first started to do my extra credit thing, and I go there all the time because I love that spot. But now, like 2 or 3 weeks have passed, I haven't had time to write that paper, although I saved my ticket and everything.
Oh,
Is that
you
okay?
don't have to write a paper if you don't, because just a ticket will give you 10 points.
Okay. Well,
I'm glad you asked. Everybody hear that? The only thing you have to write a paper about for those, a different option of extra credit is if you watch a movie or a documentary, and then you summarize, I'm sorry, what you learned about that artist or that type of artwork in a 2-page, with no documents, no research, no footnotes or anything, just your own impression of what you learned. Like the movie about Frida Kahlo will be one, or any movie about Van Gogh. There's so many. That's at least an hour, documentary or a live action movie, whichever you prefer, at least 1 hour long about any artist or any type of art, visual, of course, art, not performing arts, and then write 2 pages about that. And of course, then you'll say the name of the movie and, put your title at the top, your name in the class. So no, you get 10 points just for showing me the receipt from the museum. So send that in as a PDF or a screenshot, either one. I accept that either way. And then I'll know you went there this semester and I'll immediately give you 10 points. Okay.
okay. All
You
right. So
can do
just
it twice. Sure, you can go ahead. What did you see there? Did you see the Pompeii exhibit?
I did, yes. That was cool. I actually didn't even know that was going to be there. I just loved the permanent collection a lot. And we used to be members, but we just waited during COVID because we weren't able to go. So it was my first time back in a couple years. So I just wanted to see the normal stuff. But the Pompeii exhibit was pretty interesting.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it with one of my readers, and my daughter, she loves that kind of thing. Roman, ancient Egypt and Rome and Greece, which is a different class that I teach, our 2.1, which maybe I'll see some of you in the future. So that museum is a good one for artists from about the 1500s forward, but it stops around the turn of the 20th century. So anything from 1900 on, in the Bay Area, if you want to see paintings from that, the last 120 years, you got to go to the Museum of Modern Art, as you may know.
Yeah.
Any art museum you go to, show me the receipt or the ticket stub and proof of the time and date you went there, and you get 10 points. You can do that twice. Okay, good. Yeah, thanks. Anybody else now have any other questions about anything relating to the class? And of course, the papers, extra credit, or the slides we've been covering. Now's your chance. Or of course, you can send me by email. I check my email on weekdays. I don't check my email during the weekend much because it's family time, but that hasn't been a problem. I check mostly Monday through Friday evenings, my emails. Okay, anybody else, one more time, has any important questions you have? Do you want me to answer, or otherwise clarifications of any kind? All right, I hope I'll see all of your papers, many of them maybe even coming in before class starts, or certainly before midnight on Wednesday. And we will then finish with the late Baroque slides, and we will then segue right into the, it's not a review per se, because that's already recorded, but it will be a session on how to study for the midterm and how it's going to be graded. And it'll be very helpful. So don't miss that or sign off early, because that'll be very valuable to you. So you don't waste time studying things that won't be on the exam, and you'll know how and what to expect and how to write about the slides that are on the exam. Okay, one more time. Anybody else?
No, thank you.
All right, thank you guys. Take care. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys take care too.